In the last lecture, we used the net module to create raw TCP client and server. In this lecture, we are going to do the same thing, but with the TLS module, which is actually just a subset of the net module that adds on SSL, TLS encryption to those existing APIs. And so we don't need to write a whole bunch of new things from scratch here. I'm just going to copy what we wrote from net client and net server to two new files, and then we can modify those files just a little bit to add in the SSL certificates, etc. So I'm going to copy miscellaneous net server.js, and I'm going to copy it to miscellaneous TLS-server.js. Likewise, I'm going to copy miscellaneous net client.js, and I'm going to copy it over to miscellaneous TLS client.js. Now that these two exist, I'm going to open up TLS server first, and we can start making some modifications here. I'm going to say that this is an example TLS server, listens to port 6000, and sends the word pong to clients. Rather than having the dependency of net, I'm going to have the dependency of TLS and require TLS. This is going to be very similar to what we did when we were using both HTTP and HTTPS servers when we created the API. We did very similar things with both servers, except that HTTPS added on the ability to use the SSLs. TLS and net have the same relationship as the HTTPS and HTTP modules. Since we need to pull in the certificates, we need to use these modules we're familiar with, fs, the file system, and we're going to need path to resolve these paths. So now before we create the server, just like we did with HTTPS, we need to add some server options. In our case, options are going to equal a route to the key and a route to the certificate. This is just like we did in HTTPS, so I'm actually going to go back to lib/server, look up where we got these certificates last time, and we're going to use the same certificates. So I'm just going to paste that in here, key and cert, and since, like last time, we are inside of a directory, inside of the root folder, we can leave these paths untouched. Last time, we needed to leave the lib directory to get to the certificates. Now we need to leave the miscellaneous directory to get the certificates, but the paths that we write here that we resolve with the path module are the same. So I'm going to leave those options as is. Now we can create the server. We're going to call var server, but instead of net create server, it's TLS create server. And we need to pass it these options before we expect the callback to come back. And that is it. Everything else about this server can remain the same. It has the same exact behavior as the net server. It's just that since we instantiated it with the key and certificate, it's going to allow for TLS SSL connections. Now, I'm going to go over to the TLS client now and modify this file. One thing to note though is, since in this example we created these certificates locally, they're considered a self-signed certificate. And when you have a self-signed certificate, it doesn't have the authority of a normal SSL certificate that you would get. And so because of that, we need to include the certificate with our connections when we're creating our client. This is only the case with self-signed certificates. If you're using a real SSL, you're not going to need to do this. But for us, we do. So I'm actually going to go back to TLS server, grab the same dependencies that we just did, and paste them here instead of net. At the top, I'm going to say that this is an example TLS client, connects to port 6000 and sends the word ping. Now back to the server, I'm going to grab these options that we used and paste them inside the client. We don't need to know the key. We just need to know the certificate. So within options, I'm going to define the certificate, but I'm going to label it as CA, certificate authority. And next to here, I'm just going to write a note. This is only required because we are using a self-signed certificate. Now that we have the options in place, we can create the client. Instead of calling net create connection, we're going to call TLS connect. And rather than passing port 6000, we are first going to write the port. So we're going to call 6000, and then we're going to pass in the object full of options that we defined above. After that, sending the message is the same, client.write, and then the outbound message. When the server writes back, everything else is the same, so we can leave that there. Now, let's open up two tabs in the console. Start up the server with node miscellaneous TLS-server.js. Now that it's listening, let's start up the client and have it make that request. So we're going to call node miscellaneous TLS-client.js. Again, we see the same output that we got when we created the net client and the net server. I wrote ping and they said pong. In the TLS server, I wrote pong and they said ping. So that's how you create the same thing that you would do with net, but you create it with TLS. So now we can close this out and move on to the next lecture.